Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is vote. Today's voting day. If you haven't already voted, today's the day. And what we're going to do today is we're going to actually look at the history of voting rights in this country. And maybe we can get connected to how important this right and this opportunity to participate in our democracy is. So should be an interesting conversation. Before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And this time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together. Vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop. And allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables us to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, Rosalind. So good to have you joining us. And welcome to everybody else who's joining us. Today's message is go vote. If you haven't already, go and vote. And today we're going to take a message from Wikipedia to go through the history of voting rights in this country, which people have fought for a couple centuries. So more than a couple centuries. And people have fought and died for the right to vote. And I think it's something that we take for granted and don't necessarily value the importance of the right to vote and participate in our democracy. And I know there's a lot of cynicism. I've been guilty of that as well, as to the quality of candidates on many occasions, on the issues, on the whether how significant an impact we actually have. But let's just look at voting. We'll all get an education today together. So 1789, this is from Wikipedia. The Constitution of the United States recognizes that the states have the power to set voting requirements. A few states in 1789 allowed free Black men to vote. And New Jersey also included unmarried and widowed women who owned property. So pay attention to that, because women, as a rule, were not allowed to vote until way later. Okay, we're talking 1789. Some states allowed unmarried and widowed women who owned property, which is not a minor condition, to vote. Generally, states limited this right to property owning or tax-paying white males. which represented a mere 6% of the population. And in that same year, 1789, Georgia removed the property requirement for voting. So initially, voting was for people who were wealthy enough to be owning land, typically white men, and occasionally Black free men, and occasionally women who were property owners. 1790, the Naturalization Act of 1790 allows free white persons born outside of the United States to become citizens. However, since each state set its own requirements for voting, this act and its successor Naturalization Act of 1795 did not automatically grant these naturalized citizens the right to vote. That was 1790. 1791, Vermont is admitted as a new state, giving the vote to all men, regardless of color or property ownership. So in 1791, Vermont was pretty progressive, but again, only men got the right to vote. 1792, New Hampshire removed the property ownership as a requirement for voting, and Kentucky is admitted as a new state, giving the vote to free men regardless of color or property ownership, although the vote would shortly be taken away from free Black people. This was Kentucky, 1792, still no blanket right for women to vote. Delaware in 1792 also removed property ownership as a requirement to vote, but continues to require that voters pay taxes. 1798, Georgia removed the tax requirement for voting. 1800, only 3 states, Kentucky, New Hampshire, and Vermont, had universal white male suffrage. So that means any white man could vote. 1807, voting rights are taken away from free Black men and all women in New Jersey. Not that there were many women that were allowed to vote in the first place. 1819, economic crisis stemming from the panic of 1819 led to greater calls from propertyless men for the abolition of restrictions to voting. By 1830, the number of states with universal white male suffrage had risen to 10, although 6 still had property qualifications and 8 had tax-paying qualifications. Territories on the frontier, eager to attract new settlers, also helped expand suffrage. This is for white men. 1821, the state of New York held a constitutional convention which removed property requirements for white male voters, but required that persons of color own $250 worth of property over and above all debts in order to vote. White male voters were instead required to pay a tax, but this rule was abolished in an amendment of 1826. Requirements for persons of color were not affected by this amendment. Due to the state's policy of gradual emancipation, slavery persisted until 1827. But until then, the proportion of African Americans who were free and thus potential voters steadily increased. Native Americans still controlled large territories in upstate New York, and though typically excluded from citizenship altogether, the property requirement applied to any voter who was not white. 1828, the presidential election was the first in which non-property holding white males could vote in the vast majority of states. By the end of the 1820s, attitudes in state laws had shifted in favor of universal white male suffrage. So moving away from the property requirement to allow white men the universal right to vote. Maryland, in that same year, 1828, passes a law to allow Jews to vote. Maryland was the last state to remove religious restrictions for voting. 1837, this isn't even the 1900s yet, okay? 1837, voting rights are taken away from free Black men in Pennsylvania. 1838, Kentucky women are allowed to vote in school elections. 1840, voter turnout soared during the 1830s, reaching about 80% of adult white male population in the 1840 presidential election. In 1841, the Dorr Rebellion takes place in Rhode Island because men who did not own land could not vote. So there were rebellions as early as 1841 from white men for the right to vote. 1848, Mexicans living in U.S. territories are declared citizens in the territory of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but are often discouraged from voting. 1856, the last state to abolish property qualification was North Carolina. So white rich men was really the demographic and the population that was allowed to vote for the longest time, and then white men in general. 1860, tax-paying qualifications remained in 5 states in 1860: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and North Carolina. They survived in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island until the 20th century. In addition, many poor whites were later disenfranchised. 1866, Wisconsin gives African American men the right to vote after Ezekiel Gillespie fights for his right to vote. That's 1866 in Wisconsin. 1868, citizenship is guaranteed to all male persons born or naturalized in the United States by the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, setting the stage for future expansions to voting rights. November 3rd, 1868, the right of African American men to vote in Iowa is approved through a voter referendum. Again, men. Year later, 1869, women in Wyoming get equal suffrage rights. 1870, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution prevents states from denying the right to vote on grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This is 1870. Disenfranchisement after the Reconstruction era began soon after. Former Confederate states passed Jim Crow laws and amendments to effectively disenfranchise African American and poor white voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and other restrictions applied in a discriminatory manner. This is 1870. During this period, the Supreme Court generally upheld state efforts to discriminate against racial minorities. Only later in the 20th century were these laws ruled unconstitutional. Black males in the northern states could vote, but the majority of African Americans lived in the South. That same year, 1870, women in Utah got the right to vote. 1875, Minor versus Happersett goes to the Supreme Court, where it's decided that suffrage is not a right of citizenship, and women do not necessarily have the right to vote. 1875. 1876, Native Americans are ruled non-citizens and ineligible to vote by the Supreme Court of the United States. Virginia amends their state constitution to include paying a poll tax as a requirement to vote. 1882, Chinese immigrants lose the right to become citizens, and thus the ability to gain the right to vote through the Chinese Exclusion Act. Virginia amends their state constitution to eliminate paying the poll tax as a requirement to vote. 1883, women in Washington Territory earn the right to vote. So I think we've got, at this point, 3 states or 2 states and a territory where women have the right to vote, I think. 1887, citizenship is granted to Native Americans who are willing to disassociate themselves from their tribe by the Dawes Act, making those males technically eligible to vote. Women in Washington, we just talked about Washington Territory, lose the right to vote 4 years after they received it. Women in Utah lose the right to vote under the Edmunds-Tucker Act. This is 1887. Kansas women earn the right to vote in municipal elections. Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, North Dakota, and South Dakota grant partial suffrage to women. 1890, Native Americans can apply for citizenship through the Indian Naturalization Act. 1893, Colorado passes full women's suffrage. 1896, women in Utah regain their right to vote. Grandfather clauses are enacted in Louisiana in order to disenfranchise Black voters, and women's suffrage is won in Idaho. 1899, the right to vote in the territory of Hawaii is restricted to English and Hawaiian-speaking men, and the territory is not allowed to make its own suffrage legislation. 1901, Alabama enacts a cumulative poll tax in their state constitution. This means that all taxes that should have been paid since an eligible voter turned 21 must be paid before voting. 1902, Virginia amends their state constitution to bring back the poll tax as a requirement to vote. 1910, Washington State restores women's right to vote through the state constitution. 1911, California women earn the right to vote. 1912, women in Arizona and Kansas earn the right to vote, as do women in Oregon in 1912. 1913, direct election of senators established by the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution gave voters, rather than state legislators, the right to elect senators. White and African American women in the territory of Alaska earn the right to vote. This is 1913, as do women in Illinois. 1914, women win the right to vote in Nevada and Montana. 1917, women in Arkansas, Rhode Island, and win the right to, women in Arkansas earn the right to vote in primary elections. Women in Rhode Island earn the right to vote in presidential elections. Women in New York, Oklahoma, and South Dakota earn equal suffrage through state constitutions. 1918, women in Texas earn the right to vote in primary elections, and women in South Dakota earn the right to vote with the passage of the Citizenship Amendment. 1920, women are guaranteed the right to vote by the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. 1920. In practice, the same restrictions that hindered the ability of non-white men to vote now also applied to non-white women. 1923, Texas passes a white primary law. 1924, all Native Americans are granted citizenship and the right to vote through the Indian Citizenship Act, regardless of tribal affiliation. By this point, approximately 2/3 of Native Americans were already citizens. Notwithstanding, some Western states continued to bar Native Americans from voting until 1957. South Dakota refused to follow the law. 1925, Alaska passes a literacy test designed to disenfranchise Alaska Native voters. 1926, Georgia passes a cumulative poll tax law. 1927, Nixon versus Herndon is heard by the Supreme Court, which rules that white primary laws are unconstitutional. 1936, 32, 5 years later, Nixon versus Condon is heard by the Supreme Court, which strikes down a Texas law to allow political parties to choose who can vote in their primary elections. 1933, poll taxes are abolished in Pennsylvania. 1935, Grovey versus Townsend decides that the Democratic Party as private organization can determine who's allowed to join and therefore vote in the primaries. 1937, Breedlove versus Suttles was heard by the Supreme Court, which decides that Georgia is allowed to impose a poll tax. 1943, Chinese immigrants are given the right to gain citizenship and thus the right to vote by the Magnuson Act. 1944, the decision in Grovey versus Townsend is overturned by the case Smith versus Allwright heard before the Supreme Court. It's decided that primary elections are an integral component of the electoral process and discrimination in participation in the primaries was prohibited. 1948, Arizona and New Mexico are among the last states to extend full voting rights to Native Americans, which has been opposed by some Western states in contravention of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. 1951, Butler versus Thompson is heard by the Supreme Court, which rules that poll taxes are settled law that the state of Virginia is allowed to impose. In the 50s, there's still poll taxes. 1952, all Americans with Asian ancestry are allowed to vote through the McCarran-Walter Act. 1954, Native Americans living on reservations earn the right to vote in Maine. 1958, the provision of the North Dakota state constitution that required Native Americans to renounce their tribal affiliations 2 years before an election is removed. 1959, Alaska adopts a more lenient literacy test. 1961, residents of Washington, D.C. are granted the right to vote in U.S. presidential elections by the 23rd Amendment to the United States Constitution. 1962 to 64, a historic turning point arrived after the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren made a series of landmark decisions which help establish the nationwide one man, one vote electoral college system in the United States. In March 62, the Warren Court ruled in Baker v. Carr that redistricting qualifies as a justiciable question, thus enabling federal courts to hear redistricting cases. In February 1964, the Warren Court ruled in Westbury versus Sanders that districts in the United States House of Representatives must be approximately equal in population. In June of 64, the Warren Court ruled that in Reynolds v. Sims that each chamber of a bicameral state legislature must have electoral districts roughly equal in population. So we're not going to get through all this, but there's in 1964, poll tax payment prohibited from being used as a condition for voting in federal elections by the 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This is as recent as 1964. 1965, protection of voter registration and voting for racial minorities, later applied to language minorities, is established by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This has also been applied to correcting discriminatory election systems and districting. In 1965, in Harmon versus Fresenius, the Supreme Court ruled that poll taxes or equivalent or minor substitutes cannot be imposed on voters. 1966, tax payment with wealth requirements for voting in state elections are prohibited by the Supreme Court. This is as recent as 1966. In 1970, Alaska ends the use of literacy tests, and Native Americans who live on reservations in Colorado are first allowed to vote in that state. 1971, adults aged 18 to 21 are granted the right to vote by the 26th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This was enacted in response to the Vietnam War protests, which argued that soldiers who were old enough to fight for their country should be granted the right to vote. I encourage you to please go look and read the rest of this to see the history of the vote in our country. This is a long fought and hard-won right. And it is a way that we get to participate in our democracy. Please, 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 if you haven't already, go vote and make your voice heard. That's it for today. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And as always, it is a deep privilege and pleasure to be able to share our musings and insights and discoveries about what it is to be human. So until next time, so much love to you.